It's easy to look at the latest market reactions to Trump's threats and assume everything is just another day in the world of volatile politics and unpredictable finance. On the surface, there's an unsettling calm. Markets don't seem to have blinked. Investors, analysts, and policymakers are all watching closely, but there's no sign of panic. For most, this looks like the usual back and forth between political noise and economic fundamentals. However, beneath the surface, something is clearly different. The undercurrent of tension is palpable, yet it's being largely ignored by the mainstream narrative. The truth is that Trump's threats, this time, have failed, but the ramifications of that failure will be far-reaching. The issue is not just that Trump's bluster didn't achieve the intended effect, it's that it exposed cracks in the very institutions that are supposed to absorb and process these kinds of challenges. For all the bravado and media coverage, there's a deeper story to be told here. The response from the markets, the political world, and the institutions themselves reveals a landscape where traditional mechanisms of power are beginning to fray at the edges. The failure of Trump's threats is not just a personal misstep, it's a microcosm of a larger shift in how power is being wielded in today's political and economic world. With each move, Trump has tested the limits of what institutions will tolerate. But with this latest chapter, those limits appear to have been reached and tested and found wanting. This failure isn't just a reflection of Trump's strategies, it's an indictment of the wider system that allowed such strategies to flourish in the first place. What makes this moment even more significant is how it plays out in real time in the financial markets. Investors are not panicking, but they're no longer reacting as they once did to political threats. In the past, markets were volatile at the mention of Trump's name. Now, there's something different. A hesitation, a guarded optimism. The old patterns are breaking down, and that's where the real story lies. The institutional response is key. For years, Trump's rhetoric has kept Washington on edge, but now, the market's response, or lack thereof, is signaling a shift in how power is perceived. The usual market response to presidential threats would have been sharp declines, immediate reactions to perceived risk. But now, there's an eerie stillness, a sense of adaptation, as though the market has grown accustomed to this level of chaos. This isn't the first time Trump has shaken things up. But this time, the institutions, the markets, the financial regulators, the political elite, seem less able to react as they once did. The political strategies that once held power seem to be wearing thin, and the markets are no longer playing by the old rules. For those who are paying attention, this moment marks a profound change. But there's something more. The failure of Trump's threats to trigger any real change in the markets or broader institutions doesn't just reflect his inability to command influence in the same way as before. It also reveals something about the institutions themselves. Power is being reframed in real time, and this failure is part of the larger reshaping of global political economy. To understand why Trump's threats failed, we need to pull back the curtain on the institutional machinery that governs both political power and market response. This moment isn't just about the former president's political moves. It's about the broader system of checks and balances, market dynamics, and historical precedents that have shaped the responses we see today. The institutions that once acted as stable anchors in times of political turbulence, governments, central banks, financial markets, have been undergoing a slow transformation. Over the past few decades, these institutions have become increasingly interconnected but also increasingly brittle. In many ways, the systems in place today were designed for a different era, one where threats to stability were more straightforward and easier to manage. The rise of global financial markets, the increasing influence of technology, and the decentralization of power have made the traditional levers of control less reliable, more susceptible to disruption. Take the U.S. financial markets, for instance. In the past, whenever a president issued a threat, whether through tariffs, sanctions, or other forms of economic coercion, the market would respond with swift volatility. Political uncertainty, particularly from an unpredictable figure like Trump, used to send ripples through global markets. But as we've seen over the last few years, particularly with Trump's escalating rhetoric, the markets have grown more resilient to such threats. They've adapted. Central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve, have also played a critical role in the evolution of institutional responses. In the past, when markets trembled, the Fed could quickly step in with monetary policy tools to stabilize things. But now, there's a tension between monetary policy and political risk. The Fed's hands are often tied, not just by economic conditions, but by the political landscape itself. The risks of overreacting, particularly in an era of rising populism, have made many hesitant to take bold action in response to political instability. As a result, institutions have become less reactive, less nimble. They wait, they watch, but they don't move unless absolutely necessary. The other key player in this setup is the political system itself. Over time, the U.S. political institutions, particularly the presidency and Congress, have become more fragmented. The political polarization that has gripped the country over the past 2 decades has made cooperation and quick decision-making more difficult. Even in the face of external threats, there's a reluctance to act decisively, for fear of upsetting the delicate balance of power that exists in the government. Trump's presidency was, in many ways, a product of this dysfunction. He understood how to exploit the fractures within the system, but those same fractures have made the system less responsive, less capable of quickly neutralizing threats. At the same time, the global landscape has changed. International markets, once primarily responsive to U.S. domestic politics, now react to a far wider array of variables. China, the European Union, and emerging markets all exert influence, complicating the simple cause and effect dynamics that once governed market behavior. In this interconnected multipolar world, U.S. political threats have less of an immediate global impact than they once did. Institutions abroad have grown more resilient, more self-sufficient, and less dependent on U.S. economic or political leadership. All of this points to a deeper reality. Trump's threats failed because the system in all its complexity simply no longer responds the way it once did. Institutions are slower, more cautious, and more aware of the limits of their power. When Trump blustered, there was no institutional panic, just a slow, measured response. The market didn't react because it's grown accustomed to this kind of chaos. Political systems didn't collapse because they've learned to adapt to uncertainty. This isn't the same world it was when similar threats once caused markets to shake. The setup for this failure, then, is a combination of institutional fatigue and adaptation. The systems that once acted as stabilizers are now part of the problem. This moment of failure isn't a one-off. It's part of a larger trend where the traditional institutions of power, from Washington to Wall Street, have become less effective in maintaining control over the forces they once governed with ease. At the heart of any failed strategy lies a miscalculation. Someone, somewhere, thought that Trump's threats, the familiar mixture of strong-arm tactics, harsh rhetoric, and nationalistic appeals, would trigger the kind of response he was accustomed to: markets in disarray, political panic, and power shifts in his favor. But this time, the results were different. This misstep isn't just about Trump's failure to grasp the situation. It's about the deeper, more significant misunderstanding of how power operates in today's complex political and economic landscape. For years, Trump has relied on a strategy of unpredictability and shock value. He has understood that by rattling the political cage, whether through threats of tariffs, attacks on trade agreements, or demands for unfair economic terms, he could often force institutional players to blink first. The immediate market reactions were historically swift. The fear of a trade war, sanctions, or political destabilization would send investors scrambling, commodities plunging, and volatility spiking. It worked, time and again, as Trump played the game of disruption like a seasoned professional. But somewhere along the way, the calculus changed. Trump and his inner circle failed to account for the adaptability of the very institutions they were trying to leverage. The political landscape had grown more resilient. Washington was no longer as susceptible to shock tactics. The market, once highly responsive to his inflammatory statements, had started to internalize uncertainty. Trump's signature threats had become, over time, predictable. The shock value was gone. There's another layer to this miscalculation: the assumption that America's dominance in the global political and economic sphere would guarantee success. Trump's approach has always been rooted in the belief that the United States is an economic and geopolitical juggernaut that can set the rules. But in today's world, the U.S. is not as unchallenged as it once was. The rising influence of China, the European Union, and other emerging markets means that America's threats, while still potent, are not as immediately destabilizing as they were even a decade ago. Institutions outside the U.S. are more capable of weathering such turbulence. The global system has shifted toward a more multipolar world, and Trump's old playbook, which thrived on American supremacy, no longer fits the current reality. Moreover, Trump underestimated the institutional inertia within the U.S. government. While he believed he could exploit divisions and command unilateral action, the reality is that political institutions, from Congress to the courts, have their own sets of priorities and interests. In many cases, these institutions have learned how to ignore or minimize presidential rhetoric. The separation of powers, once a tool for maintaining stability, has now become a shield against presidential overreach. This was a fundamental error in his thinking, that the chaos he created would simply clear the way for his demands to be met. The most significant miscalculation, however, lies in the market's growing ability to absorb political threats without panic. The global financial system is now interconnected in ways that Trump's advisors and allies didn't fully comprehend. When the markets didn't respond to his threats in the same way they had in the past, it was a clear signal that they had already accounted for such risks. Investors had learned how to navigate the political turbulence that Trump had generated. In other words, the fear of Trump's actions no longer translated into immediate market reactivity. The markets had become numb to the shock value of his rhetoric. The miscalculation was that Trump assumed his rhetoric still carried the same weight. Trump's approach failed not just because of a misread of political dynamics, but also because he failed to appreciate the resilience of the institutions he was trying to manipulate. The market's muted response, the political system's capacity to absorb shock, and the global shift away from U.S. dominance combined to expose the fatal flaw in his strategy. The consequences of this miscalculation go beyond just Trump. They signal the end of an era where political theatrics could move markets and power centers. Trump's failure, therefore, is more than personal. It's an institutional failure, one that reflects the deeper transformation of global power. When Trump's threats failed to achieve their intended effects, the real story wasn't the loud headlines or the political fallout. The true response came in the quiet, behind-the-scenes shifts and subtle institutional realignments that followed. In the aftermath of his failure, power didn't suddenly dissipate, it adapted. The political and economic systems that were supposed to be rattled by Trump's bluster instead exhibited a calm that masked deeper changes occurring within the institutional fabric. The U.S. political system, which had previously been on edge with every new provocation, didn't crack this time. Instead, there was a sense of deliberate inaction. The political institutions, both Republican and Democrat, exhibited a tacit understanding. Trump's threats were no longer the existential crises they once seemed to be. Instead of pushing back with aggressive countermeasures, there was a quiet recalibration. Politicians, once quick to react to Trump's rhetoric, began to exercise restraint. This wasn't because they were suddenly more agreeable or conciliatory. It was because they realized that responding to Trump's threats was becoming a futile exercise. The rhetoric no longer carried the same weight. It's important to note that this didn't signify a collapse of institutional authority. Far from it. The system simply shifted to a more passive mode. Trump, for all his ability to disrupt, failed to provoke the kind of institutional urgency that he had in the past. Political actors no longer rushed to meet his demands, or even respond to his provocations. There was no real panic in Washington. Instead, there was a sense of self-preservation, with institutions opting to weather the storm rather than engage with it head-on. This shift was mirrored in the financial markets. As Trump continued his verbal volleys, the markets did not react with the sharp declines that would have been expected during the earlier years of his presidency. Instead, investors seemed to adopt a wait-and-see approach. They were no longer driven by the same fears that once dominated market sentiment. The markets had adjusted, recalibrating their responses not just to Trump's rhetoric, but to the broader, more structural shifts in global power dynamics. The Federal Reserve's response, or lack thereof, further illustrated this institutional adaptation. For years, the Fed had acted as the economic stabilizer whenever political chaos threatened to send the financial system into turmoil. But in the face of Trump's failure, there was no need for an aggressive intervention. The markets had, in a sense, begun to absorb the political risk, and the Fed was less inclined to act as the sole backstop. The inertia in Washington was mirrored by the institutional caution in financial regulation. Internationally, this shift was even more pronounced. Other global powers, particularly China and the European Union, had learned to deal with the volatility Trump introduced. What was once seen as a threat to the global order, Trump's brash economic policies and unpredictable political maneuvers, had become a manageable variable. Instead of rallying to counteract the U.S., the international community, including financial markets, recalibrated its approach. They no longer looked to Washington for cues. Instead, they acted independently, ensuring their resilience in the face of uncertainty. The system had evolved beyond the point where any single player, even the U.S., could dominate. What's key here is that these institutional shifts weren't dramatic or sudden. They were quiet, almost imperceptible. But they represent a profound change. Institutions have learned to adapt to the unpredictability of Trump's rhetoric, and in doing so, they've transformed the power dynamics. What was once perceived as a political earthquake is now viewed as little more than a ripple. The failure of Trump's threats, then, wasn't just a personal setback. It triggered a larger, more insidious transformation in the institutional landscape. Power didn't disappear, it simply adapted and recalibrated. The institutions that once were forced into reactive stances now found ways to remain steady, no matter how much chaos Trump generated. Trump's failure to spark the chaos he so often expected doesn't mean that the consequences of his actions will be minor. In fact, the most profound effects of this episode are likely to be those that unfold indirectly over time. When an institution's traditional levers of power fail to produce immediate results, the real changes often happen in quieter, more insidious ways. It's here that the true long-term impact of Trump's failure becomes apparent, not in the direct consequences, but in the shift of power that moves subtly, below the surface. The immediate market reaction to Trump's threats may have been underwhelming, but that doesn't mean investors have forgotten. The indifference to Trump's rhetoric signals a much deeper shift in how financial power functions. What this failure exposed was a significant erosion of trust in political power as a driver of economic direction. In the past, when Trump rattled his saber, the markets immediately sought shelter. Investors were conditioned to react to political instability with caution, often retreating to safer assets or hedging against risk. But this time they did not. The markets did not fall into the familiar patterns of volatility. They adapted. The institutional actors who drive market movements have recalibrated their expectations of what constitutes political risk. This has second-order consequences for financial institutions and their behavior. If the political system no longer reacts predictably to external threats, the financial world will have to rethink its risk models. Where once the economic stability of a country like the US was seen as a given, it will now be treated with more skepticism. Investors will be more inclined to treat US financial assets as a part of a wider, more complex system, one that is more unpredictable and potentially volatile. The consequence of Trump's failure in this regard is a shift in how markets view American power. No longer will the US be the automatic safe haven in times of uncertainty. This will gradually erode the global economic influence that Washington has long enjoyed. On the political front, the real shift is even more insidious. While Trump's failure may not have caused a massive collapse in his own standing or that of the political institutions around him, it has created an environment where other players are taking advantage of the new openings. In Washington, the breakdown of traditional political responses to crises means that other actors, those in Congress, in the executive branch, and on the international stage, are quietly moving in to fill the vacuum. These power moves happen indirectly through changes in policy, subtle realignments in alliances, and shifts in public opinion. While Trump failed to create chaos, his actions have destabilized the conventional ways of doing business. This leaves room for a more fragmented, unpredictable political landscape, where no one player dominates in the way Trump had hoped. This indirect redistribution of power is not just a result of Trump's failure, but also a consequence of the institutional inertia that followed it. The more that institutions fail to react decisively to presidential moves, the more space there is for competing interests to shape policy, markets, and international relationships. Washington is no longer a singular unified actor. Instead, we see a fracturing of influence, where competing factions are increasingly able to assert their own agendas, unhindered by the old norms of deference to presidential power. Globally, this dynamic is playing out as well. The relative indifference to Trump's threats has allowed other global powers, particularly China and the European Union, to seize opportunities and assert their own influence. Trump's bluster created an opening for China to expand its economic and geopolitical clout, particularly in Asia and Africa. Meanwhile, the EU has moved toward greater economic autonomy, reducing its reliance on US leadership. Trump's failure to dominate the international stage has, in many ways, accelerated the shift toward a more multipolar world, where American influence is just one of many factors driving global outcomes. The second-order consequences are thus far-reaching. These are not the loud, attention-grabbing consequences, but the quiet shifts that accumulate over time. Investors are recalibrating their risk models. Political power is diffusing and fragmenting. Global influence is shifting away from the US as other powers move in to fill the vacuum. The failure of Trump's threats did not just expose the fragility of his own strategies, it revealed a deeper transformation in how power operates on the global stage. This transformation will continue to unfold, often unnoticed, but with profound implications for the future of US leadership and global stability. As the dust settles from the failure of Trump's threats, a more significant story begins to emerge. One about the nature of modern power, institutional resilience, and the shifting sands of global leadership. The true ramifications of this failure are not about immediate economic upheaval or political collapse, but about how the landscape of power itself has changed. What Trump's bluster revealed was the erosion of the old ways in which power was understood and wielded, and the quiet emergence of new forms of institutional resilience that will define the future. Trump's failure in the end was not simply a failure of personality or political strategy. It was a failure to recognize the evolution of institutional power in the face of unprecedented political dynamics. The systems that once seemed infallible, the market, the U.S. government, and the global order, have adapted in ways that make them less susceptible to the kinds of disruptions that Trump sought to impose. What we are witnessing is not the death of power, but its transformation. The resilience of institutions is the story here. Far from collapsing under the weight of Trump's threats, they absorbed the shock and adjusted. Whether through a passive political response or a muted market reaction, the systems that once buckled under such pressure have evolved into something less reactive and more enduring. This is not to say that they are immune to change or crisis, but rather that they have become more adept at withstanding disruption. Institutions, in many ways, are learning how to function without the need for constant political or economic reassurance. This is a quieter, more insidious form of strength. In a sense, the failure of Trump's threats signifies the end of an era where American political power could be wielded with the kind of certainty it once had. The global power balance is shifting, and the U.S. is no longer the uncontested leader of the world order. As China, the European Union, and other emerging powers assert themselves, the U.S. must learn to navigate this multipolar world, one where its influence is no longer the dominant force. At the same time, however, the failure of Trump's approach underscores a vital lesson. Institutions are not just reactive mechanisms, but active participants in the shaping of global power. The U.S. political system, despite its current dysfunctions, remains a powerful force in the world, capable of realigning and adapting to the changing global environment. Markets, too, have demonstrated an ability to recalibrate and find equilibrium even in the face of political uncertainty. Ultimately, what we are witnessing is a redefinition of power, one where the institutions of the past are not disappearing but transforming into more flexible, resilient entities. The failure of Trump's threats did not signal the collapse of the system. Instead, it revealed the adaptability of that system to survive and even thrive in an era of unpredictability and fragmentation. The future of power is not about singular control, but about the ability to adapt, realign, and endure. The end result is this: Trump's inability to force the system to bend to his will has laid bare a new reality. Power is no longer defined by a single leader or by grandiose threats and promises. It is defined by the resilience and adaptability of the institutions that shape our world. In the wake of Trump's failure, we are witnessing a shift, not in who holds power, but in how power operates in the modern world. This is a new era of institutional resilience, one where the true strength of power lies in its ability to evolve, adapt, and persist, even when the old levers no longer work. And so, as we look forward, we realize that the greatest impact of Trump's failure isn't the immediate consequences of his threats, but the enduring transformation of power itself. The institutions that weathered this storm will face future challenges, but they are now better equipped to handle them. This moment is not